Lucifer was in charge of basically taking the gospel message to all the heavenly realms, to all the other planets, and he'd also bring them music. He'd go there and probably play and perform for them, and just bring them into that worship state of God. But unfortunately, as we know, Lucifer fell from heaven, and with him he brought a third of the stars, or a third of the angels from heaven. And because of that now, he's here on earth, and there is absolute chaos. But in your own minds, what do you think was the one thing that Lucifer brought with him? If he was good at something in heaven, do you think he would have brought it down here to earth and tried to twist it? Do you think music could be one of those things that he tries to twist? Here's a quote from philosopher Aristotle back in, I think in the 1340s. He goes on to say, "Music directly represents the passions or states of the soul's gentleness, anger, courage, temperance. If one listens to the wrong kind of music, he will become the wrong kind of person." You see, even these philosophers from the secular age back in the past knew the power of music, how it could influence minds, how it could create and change moods of people, how it could even incite people to revolt or rebellion. Here's a quote from Dr. Richard Pellegrino. He's a brain specialist, and he goes on to declare that music has the unusual power to trigger a flood of human emotions and instantaneously create very powerful changes in emotional state. So even modern experts today know the power of music, know that it has this amazing power to create chemical reactions in the brain which can change someone's mood from happy to sad to joyous. Even our medical experts know the power of music. Robert Jourdain goes on to say, "Music seems to be the most immediate of all the arts. Music possesses us. It's really as if some other has entered, not just our bodies, but our intentions, taking us over." It's an interesting thing how he uses the word possesses us. Because how many times have you been in the car and you've just been listening to music, and say if you could be listening to opera music and driving along, having a peaceful time, and suddenly you turn the radio channel and suddenly there's some hardcore rap or rock on, and someone cuts you off in the car, and then suddenly you're screaming at them and yelling, and I went through a lot of that when I was young, and yeah, music really had a controlling factor over to me, where I was a lot of the times very violent and aggressive on the road, and just from my own example, I can see that. But music does have this power to take control of us sometimes. But could there be anything more behind that? Could there be some kind of form of possession? Just a thought to think about. Robert Johnson. This man, you could say, was the one who kicked off the music industry. He was one of the first great artists of his time. And he's got an amazing story behind his road from, you could say, rags to riches. And we're going to have a brief look at that, because a lot of people just on the outside just see these characters as being singers. Even some of them are very clean cut. But the thing is, you really need to delve deep into a person's life to try to figure out what goes on behind the scenes and try to understand if that person's good to listen to or not. So Robert Johnson is one example of this. He was one of the first great, you could say, blues and rhythm guitarists of his time, and that eventually turned into rock and roll, and that's where we get a lot of the rap and R&B and hip hop and blues and jazz and all that kind of music today. And he was one of the big artists of the scene back in his days. An interesting quote by the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. They say, "Robert Johnson's songs are the bedrock upon which modern blues and rock and roll were built." So even people in the industry realize just the role that he played in this whole music scene. Rock and Roll Hall of Fame goes on to say, Robert Johnson stands at the crossroads of American music, much as a popular folk legend has it. He once stood at the Mississippi crossroads and sold his soul to the devil in exchange for guitar playing powers. It's a pretty interesting statement. Sold his soul to the devil in exchange for guitar playing powers. Now, why would they make a statement like that? Is it just something cool that they say? Well, let's take a little bit of a deeper look. Here is the crossroads of, I think it's Route 49 and 51, but don't quote me on that. But yeah, this is where apparently, I'll tell you the story. Apparently, Robert Johnson, he was, well, basically, he liked to play the guitar in his hometown. And he would play the guitar, but the problem was he had no skill. He was tone deaf, you could say, because a lot of the times he would go around and he'd be playing his guitar in front of the porches and just in their little local town, and a lot of people would just come along and go, "Robert, can you stop that racket?" A lot of testimonies from people of his town knew that he was a horrible guitar player. He had no skill whatsoever. And so they basically always kicked him out and shooed him away. So one day Robert actually grabbed his bags and he left home. He just ran away. And he was gone from home for 6 months. Then the amazing thing is when he came back, he actually saw a couple of his friends and mates sitting on one of their porches again, and he came along and he said, "Guys, can I go play a lick with you?" And a lick being as a little guitar rhythm. And they were like, "Robert, we don't want to hear that rubbish. We don't want to hear that racket anymore." And so he goes, I'll just play a lick with you anyway. And he gets out his guitar, starts playing. And all of the people that were around watching him, their jaws just dropped. Because he was playing like an absolute genius, a professional. And they would throw different songs at him, and he would play them fluently. Almost like he had just become an expert, a professional. And people who go to university to study music know that it takes a lot of effort to become so precise at music that you can play it fluently. But Robert Johnson just got that fluency like that. And if you start to look into his testimony of where this came from, he actually testified and said that he sold his soul, that one night when he was out at the corner of this crossroads, that an angel appeared to him and offered him basically wealth and fortune in exchange for his soul, pretty much. So it's an interesting story, but here's one of Robert Johnson's songs. He goes on to say, it's called Me and the Devil's Blues. He says, "Early this morning, when you knocked upon my door, and I said, 'Hello, Satan, I believe it's time to go.' Me and the devil, was walking side by side." So even in his lyrics, he portrays to us a story of this. Now this could just be lyrics, it could just be a story that he made up, but it's just interesting how he could have developed these skills out of nowhere. And just the whole circumstances of how an angel appeared before him, which classified itself as the devil and then gave him guitar playing powers. So another interesting thing about Robert Johnson was when it came for him to die, he died very young at the age of 27 of no real reason. He actually wrote a song called Hellhound on My Trail. And it was a song about this hellhound or this, you could say, the devil coming back to collect his debt and to one day probably even take his life. And the interesting thing about Robert Johnson, when he died, as testimonies say, he actually died barking like a dog at the age of 27. So did an angel come back to collect his debt when he died? I'll leave that to your speculation. Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll, as they called him. Now Elvis, another interesting story, how he came